All right, so my name's Buki Masaku, and I'm the founder of Diversity Think Tank and the author of the forthcoming book, I Don't Understand, a practical guide to navigating bias in the workplace.
So what started this journey off for you, Buki?
Well, in terms of the whole diversity and inclusion, I've been a business consultant for a number of years now in the city and globally, primarily focused around increasing productivity from a sales perspective and so forth. During that time, and prior to being a consultant, I was working in the city. And from time to time, I would be confronted with various forms of bias. And as a result, I would struggle with how to deal with it. And when I say various forms of bias, sometimes it was directed at me, but sometimes I was directing it at others without actually realizing it. And so this created a problem in my mind. And over the years, I looked at different ways of trying to address this, given that I was observing human behavior on a regular basis. In fact, in 20 years, I've probably observed something in the region of 50,000 people in every part of the globe. So I started to look at this whole idea of bias and how to address it. And culmination of that was expanding into a new area outside of my other business, and that was creating Diversity Think Tank, Diversity Think Tank, and formulating a methodology called IDU, I Don't Understand, which equips people with the skills to navigate bias in a way which hasn't been done to date. Typically, people come from a different perspective on it.
Well, let's just start with perhaps trying to explain to some listeners who maybe don't get it what you mean by unconscious bias, and can you give us some examples?
Well, unconscious bias is when people have negative conditioned views driven by societal conditioning of people in specific minorities. So an example of unconscious bias might be that women aren't suitable for certain types of roles. And this could be an unconscious view. So it's not a conscious negative thought. It's something which has been driven into them through different messages over the years. And then it just becomes a conditioned view of how they see women in the corporate workplace. So that's an example. Another example could be of minorities. Now, I'm a Black minority, so I can use me as an example. I can speak authoritatively about Black people. And so sometimes Black people are perceived as being aggressive. Sometimes they're perceived as being not serious. This is all driven by negative societal conditioning, and it affects people's behavior towards Black people when they're in the workplace unconsciously. So it's not that people are bad, or it's not that people think, oh, this person is from this ethnic origin, so I must be wary of them. It's just that society has told them that in many different ways. And so it becomes the way that they unconsciously make decisions. And it can have a massive impact on stifling careers of any minority. And I'd include women in minority there, because women are in a minority when it comes to certain types of positions in the workplace. In this country, 44% women, 50%. It's very small, the difference, but they're minorities from the perspective of their presence in certain types of roles.
Well, actually, it's 51% women population in this country.
Oh, it's more?
Yeah.
That's even worse.
I know, right. And yet we still have the gender pay gap.
Pay gap, lack of representation in certain seniority and roles and all of this kind of thing.
It's still huge. And it's really great to just have it broken down, the unconscious bias, because it isn't about making people feel guilty. It's just acknowledging this kind of systemic bias that we've had and grown up with, and acknowledging it and knowing that it needs to be addressed. So this is great. So tell us about your methodology, IDU.
Yeah, so IDU is based on the premise that at the core of the issue, when you're confronted with any form of bias, you just tend to not to understand why people are being so nasty to you. Yet in the same minute, they're really nice. This is what drove this for me. How could you be so wicked and yet so nice at the same time? How could you not see what you're saying, right? How could you not understand that this is so unfair? The injustice of this type of behavior, this type of decision, right? And you find yourself saying, I just don't understand. I really just don't understand how people could be so wicked, how they could be so insensitive. That's what you find yourself saying. And you're calling it in internally, but you never call it out. So instead of calling it in, what if you could call it out? So then the question then becomes, what? How do you call it out? Right? And the problem is with calling it out is that you don't want to invoke what I describe as defensive fragility. That is, the person thinks, how dare you say that I'm that type of person? How dare you say that I'm a sexist? How dare you say that I have issues with minority or sexual orientation? How dare you say I have issues with people that look different from me? I'm brought up in a different way. You don't want to have to deal with that. So what happens is that you never say anything. You just call it inward, right? And so what I thought is, what if we could call it out? And so since when we call it inward, we tend to say to ourselves, I really don't understand how this person could be so annoying, so wicked. What if we could say that to them? And this led me on a quest to work out how to tell people, call them out, call out their bias, how to call out their bias. And so that's what IDU is all about, how to call out bias without invoking defensive fragility. And the way that corporates tend to deal with this at the moment is what they do is they do unconscious bias training. And this unconscious bias training tends to fall into a meaning well camp, but I think it's wrong. And basically where they're coming from is what I describe as having a guilty perpetrator, hapless victim model. And this model says that I'm a bad middle class white person, and there's these poor put upon minorities. And so what I need to do is educate all of my management about being sensitive to people different from them. So if I can educate them about being sensitive to treating people different from them better, then that will improve things. But the problem with that is that the reliance is on the majority, right? So the victim, the traditional victim, is reliant on the majority to shift their mindset, to be sensitive. The other element to it is that there's training like what they call IAT, right? Which stands for, if I can remember, implicit association test. And what this does, it takes you through a process which identifies your own biases. So you may be biased towards women, or you may be biased towards people who are Black or people who are mixed heritage. You may have different types of bias, or people who are homosexual or whatever. And so that what this test does is identify those biases in the management or in the person. And then that person's supposed to work on developing themselves out of those biases and catch themselves out when they're biased and correct themselves. Now, this is all unilateral, and it's all about the majority changing the way that they think, right? What it does, it actually leaves the traditional subject as a victim because they're totally reliant on the majority shifting their paradigm. So I'm saying, well, why be reliant on that? What about self-determination? Why not equip the traditional victim with the skills to interrupt the cognitive bias shortcuts that lead to unconscious bias, right? Why not equip the subject with skills to interrupt that in the moment? Because if they can interrupt it in the moment, they not just make themselves their own situation better, they recondition the traditional perpetrator. Does this make sense?
It really does make sense. And then in particular, something that caught my eye was you referring to what has been all over the press in the last couple of weeks is the Harry and Meghan interview with Oprah Winfrey. And you refer to this as a teachable moment. Yes. I was hoping maybe you could touch upon that.
Yeah, I really do think it's a teachable moment because I think there are a couple of things within the reporting of that which was just very annoying. And I just felt I had to say something. The first thing was that there's this big hoo-ha about one of the members of the royal family, making reference to asking questions about how dark Archie would have been, or how dark Archie would be prior to him being born. Now, whilst that's an offensive thing to say, or, I can see how that could be offensive. I mean, I'd be offended by it, right? That doesn't make you a racist. Essentially, what's happening there, this is somebody who's trying to deal with the change, right? He's trying to deal with the change. And as a result of that, there's a lot of anxiety around the problem. And so what they've done is held that anxiety in. And then at the wrong time, it's come out. And what's happened is that they've said that, what happens if the he's really dark? He's got afro, or is whatever, right? Now, that might sound offensive, and it is offensive, but it's not racist, right? If you think about why people were excited when this union came together, they're excited because, oh, it's a royal wedding. Of course, we're always excited when that happens. But they're also excited because, oh, it's a mixed family, right? So the distance between anxiety and excitement is very small. In fact, it's the same rationale that drives the two issues. So millions of people had some kind of thought around, oh, what's this going to mean? A mixed royal child. And unfortunately, as we heard it, a member of the royal family was anxious about this change and voiced it. It doesn't make them a racist. We should focus on racism and stopping racism and not focusing on anxieties, which people have, which millions of people have in their own mixed families, be it race, be it religion, be it a whole load of other things. But they also have these around color. It's not nice, but it happens. And I think that was one of the things that really annoyed me. So that was the first thing that annoyed me. So I'm glad you've given me another opportunity to air my grievance with it. So the other thing which annoyed me was the press. I mean, how hypocritical are the press? The mass media. They were vilifying this woman for her race. They were creatively putting her down and making lots of issues around her. Meghan, that is, mentions in an interview the issue around the color of her baby. And then suddenly the same press are saying how awful that is and making it to a huge deal. Now, maybe it is a huge deal, but they're the same people that were running this union down creatively, not always openly, but creatively running it down. And so there's a lot of hypocrisy which has been thrown around, and I just think it needs to be called out. So that was the second.
Yeah, it really does, though, but that's where we are at with our mainstream media at the moment. So what was the third one?
The third one was to recognize that anxiety happens when you have mixed families, be it even class, right? Even people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, right? There are issues around that. If you have a couple that are same sex and they have a union, there are issues around that. And people have anxieties. Oh, they're going to have kids. What's going to happen? If they have a child, how are they going to bring them up as a heterosexual or a homosexual? These are the same anxieties, right? And I think the key point, why I say it's a teaching moment, my third point is a teachable part of this, is that, look, when these unions happen, which aren't traditional, inverted commas, there are probably going to be anxieties and issues. And so what we need to do is recognize them, be open about them, and then we can look to navigate them. And I think the same issues happen at work. People need to be able to navigate the biases that they have so that they can move beyond them. And the way to do that is to accept that they're there. But if you don't accept that they're there, then you can't actually deal with it. In fact, I talk about the inevitability of bias. As humans, we are hardwired to be biased. The discrimination is secondary. The hardwiring is the first bit. We're hardwired to put people into boxes. And then secondly, based on who they are, the discrimination comes, the bias comes. So if we can acknowledge that, then we can work to navigate it. But if we don't acknowledge it, of course we can't.
What have you learned from this, or what can we learn from this?
Well, I think there are a couple of things, right? So first of all, we need to recognize it's important that bias exists. And in terms of dealing with bias, we should not come from an eradication perspective because it's just going to fail, right? And that's what all the behavioral scientists and all these so-called experts refuse to acknowledge. And the reason why they refuse to acknowledge that is because there's some kind of allure around guilt. This self-flagellation, people want to immerse them. There's some kind of allure around it. But the reality is that there's an inevitability about bias. So coming from an eradication perspective is not really going to lead you anywhere good in a hurry, right? So what I encourage people and what I talk about in my book is to come from a navigation perspective. That is, how do we navigate it? It's like, do you do sailing? Have you ever sailed? Yeah, I haven't either, right? But I'm told by people that do it, right, it's very difficult. It's a tough sport. And there are certain constants there, like the rough waves, the wind, the rain, the snow, if it's snowing, right? These are there. There's nothing you can do about them. If you want to sail, you're going to have to deal with them. Unless you can call on celestial powers, you're not going to be able to get rid of them. But people still sail and they still get to their destination. And how do they do that? They navigate these factors. They navigate them. And we have to have the same approach with bias in terms of navigating bias. I would just say, in terms of giving something practical ways of looking at bias, there are two forms of bias. There's directional bias. Well, that's what I call it. Directional bias. That's when somebody's being biased towards me because of my race, because of my sexual orientation, because of my gender, and so on. That's directional bias. We have to work out how to deal with that. And then there is reverse bias, and this is the problem. Nobody wants to talk about reverse bias. There's reverse bias, where because of all the bad things and all the negative conditioning that I've had to deal with from people who are different from me, I assume that when anybody makes a bad decision who's different from me, maybe a white person, middle-class manager, who's different from me, makes a decision which is unfavorable to me, I assume that they're coming from a place of bias. Now, this is where it gets tricky. That's actually my bias. So now I become the perpetrator and they become the victim. But nobody wants to understand that. But that's the problem. And here's the worst thing, which compounds the situation. In that situation, I become the perpetrator, they become the victim. Neither of us call it out. So I think that they're coming from a place of bias, but I would never say that to them, right? But what I do is I look for somebody who looks like me and I'll tell them, which reinforces the bias about the majority. Now, the person who's the traditional perpetrator, I hope you're still with me.
Yeah.
The person who's the traditional perpetrator sees that I think that they're coming from a place of bias, but they don't tell me. What they do is look for somebody who looks like them, same ability level, or same color, or same sex. And they tell them, and they say, oh yeah, some of these black guys, they have like a chip on their shoulder, which reinforces that bias. And never the twain shall meet. So I'm saying, what if we could call it out? And the way to call it out is to simply say, I don't understand. We call this dispassionate developmental inquiry. Just come from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry. Tell them that you don't understand. Now, there are many ways of doing that, and I go through that in my book, but essentially, that's essentially what you want to do. It's the purest, it's the most unscathed place that you could come from. And guess what? Here's the good news. When you come from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry and you say some words to the effect of, look, I really don't understand, could you tell me the criteria for giving that project to somebody else, or what the criteria was for giving out that project? When you ask that question, it invokes the teaching or coach in the manager. And typically it's a manager, so it's the person who's senior that you're talking to. It invokes that. So they'll go, yeah, I'll show you. And then they'll start to talk about the decision that they made. And of course, within their explanation, the bias unearths itself. So you don't have to say that you told her, you gave the job to her and you didn't give it to me because of X, Y, and Z. Or you gave it to, you don't need to do all that. All you need to do is come from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry, and you will invoke the teaching in the person. And the person will start to, well, I'll show you. And it also speaks to ego. Because some people say to me when I teach, they say, yeah, but our managers don't care. Our managers are hard-nosed. They don't care about our development. It really doesn't matter, because when you come from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry to a person who's got a big ego, they'll want to justify their position. So again, they'll start saying, well, this is why I did this, and this is the criteria, and this is the criteria. And as long as you stay on the line of dispassionate developmental inquiry, go, I don't understand, right? As long as you stay on that line of questioning, what you're going to find is that they're going to talk more, and the bias will reveal itself. It will illuminate itself, and then it will become obvious to them. And then you can work collaboratively with them to try and sort it out, and you can hold them accountable for it. Does that make sense?
It really makes sense. I'm thinking about, what about in more of a family circle, say going back to Harry and Meghan? How do you think it could have been handled better?
Well, I think, first of all, I think there could have been some counseling. That might sound bizarre, but, let's face it, it's a royal family. And here's the other thing, diversity and inclusion, you can't have it both one way and not the other way. The royals are a minority. People don't want them to be a minority. People don't want to accept that they're a minority, but they are. How many royal families do you know, Miranda? How many do you know? Do you know many?
No.
Do you know? Right? Right? They're a minority. So these situations are compounded with them. So we can't just expect them to be like us. Well, I wouldn't have any problem with a mixed child. I wouldn't have that issue. Well, you're just being, well, maybe you wouldn't. And I'm not excusing them for that. However, I do think many people do have kind of anxieties about mixed children. But I think the first thing I suggested was that it would be obvious that these were going to be issues. So I would have encouraged them to have some kind of counseling around this. How are we going to deal with this? Be honest about how you feel about this. That would be the first thing. Then Meghan could say she doesn't understand, if the person is that had anxiety. Obviously, have that kind of open discussion. I think that would be the first thing I would have suggested to have happened. And I think if they'd done that, I think what happens is that you're not calling in the issues. You're not calling in your anxieties. They're called out. And then you can have an explanation. You can go through that process. And it's a very simple process that you can go through. In fact, I've got it into a process. Do you want to know what the process is?
I do.
Okay, right. Well, the first step is mindset, right? The first step in this process is mindset. And what people must do is they must leave their baggage in the lobby. Leave your luggage in the lobby. Even though you have every right to have this luggage, so gender bias luggage, sexual orientation luggage, racial bias luggage, disability luggage. You have every right to have this luggage, religious luggage. You have every right to have it, but you need to drop it, right? When you're addressing these issues with a person or persons, you need to drop it, right? And there are a number of reasons why you need to drop it, but the biggest reason as far as solving this kind of issue is because it's the only way you can move to step 2. Which begs the question, what is step 2? And step 2 is to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. Assume everybody's coming from a good place. Assume their anxieties are coming from a good place. They're nice people. Give everybody the benefit of the doubt. But here's the rub. Call it out anyway. Call out the sensed, and it's always sensed. Call out the sensed bias anyway, right? So step 1 is mindset, leave the luggage in the lobby. Step 2 is give everybody the benefit of the doubt, but call it out anyway. And the it being the bias, call the bias out anyway, which leads us to step 3 and a big question. The big question is, but how do you call out the bias without invoking defensive fragility? That is, you get their back up, you get them defensive. How do you do that? Well, the way to do that is to come from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry. That is, I want to understand. Show me. You're the teacher. Show me, explain to me. And that will invoke the coaching, the teaching in the person, or the justification if you've got an egomaniac type person. And they will outline their justification. And if it doesn't make sense to you, which if they are coming from a place of bias, or it still doesn't, or wherever they're coming from, and it still doesn't make sense to you, then say that. Just say, well, look, I hear what you're saying, but I don't understand why this should be a problem. We're in a multicultural society. People have mixed marriages and mixed children. I don't understand why it would be a problem. Could you explain? And then get the person to explain. The person will explain. They'll keep and stay on that. The problem, Miranda, is that most people aren't, and this is what we teach. People aren't able to stick with that line of questioning. They flip out. They lose it. And then they start chucking their toys out of the pram, or they start getting parental. And then the other person responds in kind, and then it all starts kicking off, and it all goes horribly wrong. And then you have things like happened in Bristol the other day. This is what happens. So I've shown you 3 steps. There are 4 here, right? So the first one was mindset. The second one was give everybody the benefit of the doubt, but call it out. The third one was the way to call it out is to come from a place of dispassionate developmental inquiry. And I would also say this is a sub-step. A sub-step is never talk about the issue. So let's say the issue is racism or bias. Don't talk about that. Just talk about the problem. So the problem is the anxiety in this situation. So I just don't understand why you're anxious. That's what you should say. You shouldn't be saying, I don't understand why you have such racist views, because that's just not going to work for you. So that's a sub-step. Always focus on the problem, never focus on the issue. And then the 4th step is just having gone through that process, you can collaboratively agree a next step. What's the ideal next step? With family, I don't know. It depends on the scenario. Let's see how this pans out, which ultimately is what they did do. Ironically, if we talk about the royals, what ultimately happened? The baby was born. And of course, when everybody sees a baby, whatever it looks like, everybody's like, mwah, 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 mwah. So, let me touch that child. And everything was okay. So I would have suggested a level of counseling would have been the right thing to do. It's easy to say now with hindsight, but that's what I would have suggested. So does that help?
It really does, because this is a conversation that's affecting millions of people every day now. In the next 100 years, we're looking at most of the population being of dual heritage. So it's a conversation most of us are going to be having at some point. So it's really great to sort of talk about some skills and how we can handle it. So it's a real privilege having you on the show today. Thank you, Buku. Just remind our listeners the name of the book and where we can get it from.
Yeah, so the book is I Don't Understand, a practical guide to navigating bias in the workplace. If you go to navigatingbias.com, it's available there, as well as with some other freebies. Also, you can go to bukimasaku, BUKIMOSAKU.com, and you can find information on it there too.
Brilliant. Thank you for your time today, Buki.